Christine Swallow is a director who was appointed by the Governor Steve Nowosky in January of 2019 as director of the Nevada Department of Transportation. With more than 25 years of experience in advocacy, public policy, and practicing civil engineer, Christina has worked in several technical areas, including flood control. Sorry about that, I had the YouTube delay there. Land development, public works, and transportation policy. A thought leader, Christina artfully blends her breadth of experience and ability to communicate concerns at hand to achieve the goals of the greater good. She strongly believes the key to successful transportation systems lies in the strength of the plan. We also have Steve Hakes. Steve has been actively involved with ASCE and SEI since 2013. In 2013, he helped establish the Colorado chapter of SEI, which culminated in his serving as the president from 2016 to 17. He continues to serve as an advisor to current local leadership. He currently serves on the Region 7 Board of Governors for ASCE, with continuing to maintain activity in the ASCE's Colorado Government Affairs Committee, and is a regular participant in the ASCE's annual legislative fly-in. In 2019, he assisted with the preparation and release of the ASCE's 2020 Colorado Infrastructure Report Card. His main focus with the report card was helping elected officials, the public, and agencies understand the critical need for infrastructure investment and the consequences from inaction. Professionally, Steve is a project manager for Alfred Benish and Company working out of their Denver office. His expertise is in management of structural design and inspection projects with the emphasis on bridge. In his free time, he enjoys relaxing with his wife and 4 kids, golfing, skiing, biking, playing basketball, or developing new musical talents. It's a lot of stuff he's working on. And then we have Anna Denneke. Anna Denneke is the Director of Infrastructure and Senate at the American Society of Civil Engineers. In that role, she oversees ASCE's report card for America's infrastructure program, our topic of today's discussion, including the development of national and state grades. She also produces and reports that examine best practices in infrastructure policy and the impacts of underinvestment in our roads, bridges, airports, and more. Previously, she worked as the policy and member communications manager for the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors. Anna also worked in political and nonprofit fundraising in the Los Angeles region. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and history from the University of Southern California. So now I want to start off today with a discussion and a question to our panelists is how did you each get involved in our government relations at the national and local level? And I'll start off by sharing how I got involved. I was a practicing structural engineer, and one of my clients was an architect, and he was the chair of our local town planning commission. He asked me if I wanted to join the commission. I accepted and was appointed, and this started a 12-year involvement in both the local planning and inland wetland waterway commissions. I realized that so few people in my town of 5,000 were involved in these important decisions, and this lack of involvement created my advocacy of promoting involvement in public policy. So now I want to ask each of the panelists today how you got involved in the government relations and public policy. Christina, could you share your story?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I actually don't remember exactly the first time that I got involved or engaged. I know I heard a lot about the Key Contact Program in my earlier years in ASCE, but I think the most critical part of my engagement was learning about a former program that ASCE had, the ASCE Congressional Fellow Program. A colleague of mine, actually the director of the Houston Public Works Department now, but she and I served on a committee together early in our careers, an ASCE committee, and she later became one of the congressional fellows. And several years after that, I applied to be the fellow because I wasn't really sure why the policies existed at the local level and whether or not they fed up to federal policies. And I wanted to learn how to have a little bit more of a role in that process. So I applied to become the ASCE Congressional Fellow and ended up serving 1 year as the fellow and 3 years in Washington, D.C. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about that later today.
Thank you, Christina. Steve, do you want to share your story with us?
Kind of like Christina, I don't know if I totally remember the exact specifics of when I got involved, but I remember as I reflect back, early in my career, my whole focus was technical proficiency and working on cool projects. I didn't really care about much because I was young. I just wanted to learn and do cool things. As I matured in my career, I started working more closely with clients, and most of my clients are public agencies. I started realizing there's some difficult decisions they're going through in terms of funding, and what can they do with what limited funds they have. And at the same time, I was finishing my service in the leadership of SEI here in the Colorado area, and I was looking for the next opportunity to serve. And it just kind of, the two came together, and I just heard about the opportunity for the fly-in. I grew up back east, so getting back to Washington, D.C. sounded like an awesome opportunity. And so I took advantage of that and started getting involved with the government affairs and on the local and national level. And in the last 2 or 3 years, it's just kind of ballooned from there. It's been an awesome experience.
Thanks for sharing that, Steve. And Anna, how about you?
Sure. Well, I'm a little bit different in that this is my job, but I'll share how I got interested in infrastructure policy. I think, my dad is an urban planner and my mom is a lawyer, and sometimes I feel like I combined their careers into what I do today. I will say, there's a lot of people in Washington that work on a lot of cool things, but I really believe truly that what we're doing to advocate for increased investment in infrastructure has a enormously outsized impact on upward mobility and economic, empowerment. And so I think obviously that's a message we'll talk about in a bit that is now being reflected from the very highest levels of government here in Washington. But it's an exciting area to be in, and I love working for ASCE because you all are such respected voices in Washington. When you go to Capitol Hill, you are the experts, the lawmakers listen to you, and it's just a pleasure to get to train you all for those conversations and help you put together tools that can communicate your expertise.
Well, thank you, Anna, too. So I want to start off with Anna and talking about what is the report card and what you've been working on for the last 3 years.
Sure. So I'm going to hopefully successfully share my screen. Do you all see that? Okay, wonderful. Well, hopefully you all are aware at this point that we did come out with our quadrennial infrastructure report card on March 3rd. Christina is the chair of the committee that writes and advises on the national report card. We came out with an overall GPA of a C-. Let me briefly first talk about the methodology behind these grades. Christina will actually delve into some of the details in a little bit, but essentially we use 8 key criteria to assign category grades. Those are things like capacity and condition, funding and future need, public safety, resilience, O&M, and innovation. We are a committee of about 32 civil engineers from around the country, really experts in their respective fields, come together, collect information, aggregate data, especially data sources from the federal level, as well as supplementing that federal information with data and reports from our partners, stakeholders, other associations. They assess the available data and reports and assign a grade based on those 8 key criteria that I mentioned. Our overall GPA, as I said, is a C-. That is actually a modest uptick from 2017 when we were in the D+ range. You can see on the right side of your screen what each category means. In general, we are in the C and D range. Things are in mediocre condition to poor condition. We have a few categories, ports and rail, that are in good condition. Those are our leaders on this report card. While a C- was a modest improvement, it's obviously not a grade you would want your child to bring home from school, and we still have a lot of work to do. In fact, 11 categories are still in the D range. Let me briefly touch on the highest and lowest grades. As I mentioned, rail did get our highest grade. It was a B. In general, freight rail is the freight system, the freight rail companies are investing in their network. They spend about $260,000 per mile Capacity is mostly sufficient. However, for those of you that live on the Northeast Corridor, Boston to DC, you are very familiar with the passenger rail challenges that we face on that component of the network. And there is some additional money for Amtrak in some recent appropriations bills and in the proposal that Biden released a few days ago. However, there's a significant backlog in the rail sector. And then our lowest grade was transit. Again, for those of you that live in larger cities, perhaps with some of the legacy systems, Chicago, San Francisco, DC, you are all too familiar with the maintenance backlog and the impacts on the system performance. We also see only 45% of Americans have access to transit in the first place, which is a real significant challenge for older populations, for students, for individuals of all income levels. So obviously we have a lot of work to do. Before I turn it over to Christina, I just wanted to mention a couple of macro trends from the report card that I think are of especially interesting. The first, as I mentioned, backlog maintenance across multiple systems, everything from wastewater to transit to stormwater, our maintenance backlogs are significant. So we are advocating for a fix-it-first approach as we think through potential investment from Washington. Let's fix the roads before we build new ones. Secondly, we are seeing across several categories improvements because of asset management. So I'll draw your attention to drinking water. That was the highest jump in grade. It went from a D in 2017 to a C- in 2021. In part, that really is because a larger and larger percentage of utilities are utilizing asset management to direct very limited funds. We are seeing not only utilities utilize, take assessment of the condition of their infrastructure, but also use sophisticated ways of asset management and really prioritizing repairs that benefit the most number of people. And then the final sort of macro trend I wanted to emphasize is we are unfortunately contending with scarce data in a number of categories. So for example, stormwater and schools. There is no aggregate national database of school infrastructure or stormwater conditions, which can hinder us in our ability to assess the category, but also impacts us when we want to make smart decisions with limited funding. So that's something we're emphasizing to federal agencies like EPA, as well as Congress as they think through ways to improve our infrastructure. We need to figure out what we have and in what shape it's in, as we also think through what funding should be spent and where. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Christina to talk a little bit about structural engineering specifically as it relates to the report card and her experience in the public policy space.
Thanks, Anna. I love when we talk about our report card and the need to invest in infrastructure, because it really enables us to have a good conversation with our members about why it's so critically important. And I think like right now is a really great time to be having this conversation because it's all over the news. The interest at the federal level to invest in infrastructure has been a main talking point for over a week now at the federal level. So we know that President Biden unveiled the American Jobs Plan, and that proposes investment in all 17 of our report card categories. So it's very exciting to see this level of interest. It's not new to see this level of interest. In fact, over many of the last several election cycles, we've seen presidential candidates, we've seen senatorial, congressional candidates, they all talk about our report card and they understand how critically important it is to invest in our infrastructure and really reverse this underinvestment. I mean, the grades have gotten to where they are because we haven't been investing for so long, and they've just slowly fallen into where they are. And then I guess the last 4 years, they crept up a little bit. The unfortunate part though, is Biden's plan is right now just a plan. It's just a proposal. And now Congress needs to figure out what they're going to actually draft. So what did they take from his proposal What do they take from the various administrative pieces they've seen in the past? What do they take and what do they move forward? And then they have to pass it. And so I think that's why it's so important that we as engineers broadly, and I should note, if you didn't get it from my background, I am not a structural engineer, but broadly as civil engineers and structural engineers, we all need to be active and thinking about this and engaged. I mentioned briefly that in my intro that I had worked in Washington, D.C. for 3 years, and I worked for a senator. I did transportation policy for that senator, and it was during a critical time on transportation policy that I was there. And we had a lot of conversations about policy initiatives that should be advanced, things that the senator was interested in, things that I thought the senator might be interested in. And oftentimes the question came down to, well, have we heard from anyone? Who have we heard from? And unfortunately, we didn't hear from a lot of constituents. And you and I and every single person on this call were constituents. And we're passionate about what we do. We love what we do. We love delivering the infrastructure. We love making things better for our friends and our neighbors and our community. But we forget that we need to tell that story, and we need to reach out to our legislators to say how critically important it is that they act on this policy, that they advance policies, and they're waiting to hear from us. When I was there, in the 3 years that I was there, the first year was the year that the Affordable Care Act passed. So that passed in late 2009. And when that was up for discussion on the floor and in the committees, our phone lines would shut down. That's how many people we would hear from that cared about Affordable Care Act. And then you can contrast that to when infrastructure policies are on the table and being discussed. And they do hear periodically from engineers. They do hear from the local agencies and the state agencies. They really want to hear a lot more from each and every single one of us. And so it's our role and it's our duty to make sure that we're weighing in, we're saying what works, we're saying what needs to be improved, we're saying how we will put that policy into action. And in 4 years from now, hopefully see another uptick. But if not in 4 years, in 8 or in 12, because it takes time. This didn't happen over 4 years. This took decades, and it will take us decades to bring it back up. But it will start with that first step of policy of the federal government taking action to increase investment. And so that, and we need to encourage them to do that.
Thank you, Christine. Steve, could you tell us a little bit, you meant in your bio, in your discussion, you talked about the fly-in and how that changed sort of what you were working on in your pathway through in ASCE and SCI?
Yeah. So I like people, so the opportunity to go and talk to people that I never met, that I didn't get phased at all by that. And it's actually really easy to do when you have a tool like the report card in your hand. We all relate to those grades. It's a very simple, straightforward way of presenting where we're at. And so that's really why I signed up. And the cool thing with the fly-in is there are tons of resources that ASCE, Anna, and her group put together to make sure we know what we're doing and we're projecting the right message. And first, that we understand the message. So there's training ahead of time. There's training when we get to DC. And I went in knowing very little about public policy. Aside from Schoolhouse Rock, I didn't know how government worked. But I got a little bit of a crash course, and then you understand what we need to do to help the legislators understand and come on board with the need for infrastructure investment. And that is not something that is unique to engineers. And I think we all recognize that. Anybody that wakes up in the morning, our families, our friends, they all suffer the same negative impacts from poor infrastructure. And Christine was mentioning it, we need to become those storytellers to make sure that message gets communicated to the people in DC and also at the state and local level. But we're talking more about DC right now. Make sure they understand what their constituents are feeling and the negative impacts it might have. And so that's really why I got involved. And it is surprisingly easy. I know some people might be sitting here because engineers as a whole, maybe even especially structural engineers, tend to be introverts. We don't like talking to people, but it's really not hard at all. The report card it's got pretty colors, pretty graphics, and it tells a story for you. And then you can just add your own personal touch. And so it's been fun doing that. And this last year, because of everything with COVID, we had to do everything virtually, but the impact was still there. And we were able to connect with, with the staff of some of the legislators to help them to understand where we're coming from, what little steps they can do to impact major change, and to be the leaders on the national level for the rest of the country to make the proper decisions and investment in infrastructure.
Well, we're going to have to use you as a spokesperson a lot more now after that. So Anna, maybe you could just tell the listeners a little bit about the fly-in, kind of like what both Christina and Steve mentioned, that just kind of briefly. It has changed a lot in the last 2 years, but hopefully we can go back to the non-virtual fly-in, but just kind of a little bit about that program so people can look for it hopefully in 2022.
Sure. The fly-in happens every year, usually the first or second week of March. We bring about 250 ASCE members to Washington to really, and these are, our tried and true, as well as some new voices. So we ask that you be a key contact as sort of a first step, get your feet wet in terms of getting this week in Washington, reading what's happening in the legislature as it pertains to infrastructure. We ask that you may have the beginnings of a relationship developed with your member of Congress and or their staff. Then you come to Washington and there's about 2 days of training where we get in a ballroom, hopefully in the not too distant future. We sit down, we study the issues, we hear from some speakers, we learn about what we're there for to talk to Congress about. So depending on the legislative cycle, you may be there to talk about the importance of passing a water resources bill. You may be there to talk about the importance of fixing the Highway Trust Fund. You may be there to talk about the importance of providing money for the dam rehabilitation program. We help identify some of our top asks. We educate you about the programs if you're not as familiar about them. We give you the confidence that you might need to walk into an elected official's office. Again, you are the expert, not them. And then we send you out to the Hill. So you'll usually be in groups, especially for your Senate meetings. You will have a scheduled time to meet with your elected official or their senior staff. And really, they do so many of these in a day. So we give you the tools to, stand out, clearly communicate your asks, be the authority, the authoritative voice, and then continue that relationship, continue to serve as the infrastructure expert for your elected officials after you go home. So it's a lot of leadership training, as well as, education in what's going on in the public policy space. And I'm biased, but I think it's a lot of fun, and I think our members also enjoy it. There is an application process, and the application usually goes live around the beginning of November.
Right, and you try to get a diverse representation, so there's always some representations from the SCI community.
Correct, yes.
I wanted to remind everybody that if you had a question you wanted to ask our panelists, just put it in the chat and we'll try to queue those up to ask them. But Christine, I know when I came to ASCE and I was learning about the report card and behind it, and I was thinking before that it was just to do about highways and bridges are structural. But when I started reading about all of the categories, I realized that really structural engineers have a lot of touch points in some of the other categories. So I don't know if you and Anna could talk a little bit about the energy, which is very important to us in our ETS and electric grid, dams we mentioned, but also the school categories and how structural engineers should know about them and can help with the report card advocacy.
Laura, I look at these categories and I'm not sure there's a single category in there that's not somehow related to structural engineering. It may not be the primary focus, but structural engineers are really engaged in all of these categories in one way, shape, or another. I did want to touch on bridges briefly before I jump into those other couple that you mentioned, simply because it was the only category that went down. And I think that's important because we often think we're lucky in Nevada where we generally rank really well with our bridges. Our bridges are still really young compared to many in the nation. Across the nation, there's over 617,000 bridges, and 42% of those are over 50 years old. So that's important to know. And the average age is 44 years old, and that is ticking up. And so in the past several report cards, we've really been focusing on the number of structurally deficient bridges. And in doing that, there's been a lot of effort placed on fixing and repairing and replacing those bridges. And so that still is a good metric that we're looking at. But what we've noticed is that increasingly the age, so that average age is ticking up. The average age is up to 44 now. And there's more bridges in that fair category. So what we're afraid of and what we're concerned about is that backlog is going to increase. And at some point in the future, those bridges, as they continue to age, we're not going to be able to take care of them when that happens. So we need to make sure that we're investing today to keep those bridges in a good state of repair. And in fact, that backlog right now is estimated to be $125 billion. It's roughly 58%. We'd have to increase our funding on that by roughly 58%. So it's not a small number. And it's important to recognize that while our local agencies and our state agencies, and I think this is something that Steve mentioned, the agencies are doing what they can with the resources they have. The critical piece is making sure that we provide additional resources, whether it's through federal, state, or local action. So I think that's important to also recognize in the overall messaging of the report card. We're not saying the agencies are doing a bad job. We're saying actually the agencies are doing everything they can with what they have. They just don't have enough. And so I wanted to touch on that. And then I'm going to jump in now on, you asked about a couple of others. So the energy category is something that we think about broadly. And this one is something, Anna mentioned rail and how good freight rail is doing, but possibly how challenged the passenger rail is. Energy is also one of those categories that we need to think about, like what's our role in and what are we measuring? We're not measuring generation. We're not reporting on generation and energy. We are reporting on the transmission and the distribution. And that's where the structural engineers play a really big role, is in the structures that carry the lines. And so that's where we start thinking about it. And in that space, this category was one of the ones that went up because there has been a lot of investment in the transmission space. We need to invest in transmission as we start looking at a more green economy and shutting down plants in some areas and opening plants in others. We need to make sure that energy gets from where it is to where it needs to go, which may be a different location than it started. But they've been investing in that transmission. The problem is we still have a lot of outages. We still have a lot of issues with reliability. We certainly saw that in Texas. But again, in Texas, it wasn't our space. That was generation. That wasn't transmission. It wasn't distribution. And so it's important to make sure that we differentiate the role of civil engineers and what we're looking for. One of our key areas in energy that we are looking at focusing that investment is really in the distribution infrastructure. That's where the majority of the reliability issues happen. It happens once it gets off the transmission system and into that distribution, as it's going to your house, as it's going to your business. And so really, that's where we need to focus a lot of that investment. But the good news on energy is that the grade actually did tick up, and it was one of the handful that did. So we just need to make sure we continue to invest and do it in the most efficient way possible. So now I'm going to pivot to dams. You asked a little bit about dams, and dams. I live in a large western state out in Nevada, and so we think about our big giant dam that we have, and we forget how many dams there are all over. There's over 91,000 dams in the nation, and they're largely privately owned, which creates an interesting dichotomy there, between the privately owned. Again, Anna mentioned freight rail. The private owners are investing. A lot of times the private owners in dams are investing. They understand how critically important those dams are and for their business, and they're willing to make that investment. We need to make sure that the public understands how critically important those dams are, especially the publicly owned dams, to our livelihood and to our safety. Of those 91,000 dams, there are a significant number of those that are high hazard dams, and they're not high hazard because there's a problem with them. They're high hazard because we've built land, we've developed the land below them. So if something were to happen to those dams, there would be a large potential loss of life or damage because there's all these people living right at the base of that dam. The problem isn't the high hazard dam. The problem is the fact that 2,300 of those are also deficient. And so we need to be thinking about ensuring that we have the emergency action plans available for all of the dams. Fortunately, as the number of high hazard dams has increased, so has the emergency action plans, but we need to make sure that we're not just developing those emergency action plans, we're also doing the infrastructure, doing the investment needed to keep those dams operating safe and effective. So, and we know that structural engineers have a large role in that dam space. And then the last one you asked about was school facilities, and schools are interesting. So they stayed flat, they didn't increase, they didn't fall. Anna mentioned there is not a national source of information for all schools, but we do know that there are approximately 84,000 public schools with over 100,000 buildings associated with them. And more than 1/3 of public schools have portable buildings due to capacity constraints. And 45% of those portable buildings are in fair or poor condition. And so there's a great opportunity for us to invest in our schools. Unfortunately, investment has fallen between 2008 and 2017. And we believe that there's at least a $38 billion shortfall. So this is one of those spaces that it's important for us. Yes, there is a possible federal role, but this is very much a state and a local role of talking to our state and our local legislators and letting them know about our role, how critically important it is that they invest in schools, and our role in helping deliver facilities that are prepped and primed to learn. If you have students that are going to schools where the facilities aren't effective and efficient, they're not going to be able to learn as well. It's going to hold them back. And ultimately, that's going to hold back their ability to contribute to our economy and our communities in the future. So like I started, you asked about 3 categories. I talked about 4 categories. There are 17, and structural engineers have a role in every single one of those categories. But even beyond structural engineers, we as members of our communities have a role in telling our legislators it's time to invest, because it impacts, as Steve mentioned, it impacts every single one of us. If the water doesn't turn on, if this year with broadband, broadband isn't a category, but it's something we're increasingly talking about. Can you learn remotely? How can broadband help us meet some of our issues with transportation? They're all interlinked, and it's systemic. We need to work and think about our infrastructure as a system overall.
Thank you so much, Christina. I know everybody should go to the webpage that to show the report card, and it has all of the information about all the different categories too, also correct, that we can put up in the chat. But I wanted to go, Steve, Christina talked a little bit about bridges, and that's your expertise in structural engineering. And we do have a question from our listeners, and I wanted to see if you wanted to take this one, and it's about improving the grade from the C- to emerging technologies like accelerated bridge construction. Could that be a solution to the question of improving the grade? And how about the development of performance-based codes? Do you see that as helping with improving the grades?
So that's a great question. I am no economist, so I don't know the exact answer, but that is the right mindset. Thinking innovatively to try to improve infrastructure. I know one of the benefits of accelerated bridge construction is the ability to get in and replace a bridge while minimizing the impact to the public. So sometimes I might come at a higher dollar amount, but if it reduces the impact to the general public, I think that's a better thing, because we are sitting in our cars less. We're doing more things that we need to be doing to generate revenue, which comes into funding eventually when you think of the big picture of things. But I don't think it's simply let's do everything accelerated bridge construction, because there are plenty of times when that doesn't make sense. But like I said, that's the right thinking. What can we do to innovate the way we design? The one thing with accelerated bridge construction, I haven't done a lot of work in Texas, but I have I've talked to some people down there in Texas. A lot of times it seems like they have fairly standardized designs, and so people might think of that as accelerated bridge construction. So instead of doing a unique design for everything, they take standards and are able to design things quicker. And of course, Texas has, in a lot of places, more space than other states, especially back east where you guys are squeezing in construction into, really small existing corridors. But that kind of thinking helps them to be more efficient in their designs, which helps them to stretch their dollars to do more work. And there is a economy of scale when you do things repetitively. So once again, that's the kind of thinking that might lead to increasing the score by using our funds more wisely. The other question about performance-based codes, LRFD was always kind of intended to be that way. And I think it's done a good job of trying to refine our designs to make them more efficient. Once again, utilizing resources wisely. I think if we did performance-based codes, that can help, but we need to be careful that we don't get to have too much going on. We don't need to complicate things with engineering. We want to make sure that we keep things efficient, utilizing best practices, and talk about performance-based codes. I mean, I really think about performance-based specs where we tell a contractor, we're not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to tell you that this is what it has to do. That kind of is what we do with the codes now. We don't say this is exactly how you have to design a bridge, but your bridge needs to be able to carry X, Y, Z loads, should have a 75 to 100 year design life. So that's kind of the intent of the codes now. I don't know if I know the full answer to your question, but it'd be good something maybe to investigate a little bit more to see if there would be a benefit to tweak or add. But I just want to caution us from thinking, oh, we've got to change the way we do things. What we're doing is working in a lot of spots as engineers. The problem isn't us. It isn't the people we work for. It's really a funding issue. And that's really where a lot of the focus needs to go. And performance-based codes might help a little bit, but won't be the big ticket item to get us to that point of raising the grades.
Thanks, Steve. I kind of want to switch the conversation a little bit now. We've been talking about the national, report card, and I know that Steve, you were involved in all of you were all involved in your local state report cards. I did national and the state report cards, and what's the activity you've been having with the state report cards? And
Sure. So the state report card program is really an opportunity for you to localize the issues that appear in the national report card. State report cards take about a year to develop. You put together a committee chaired by an individual or individuals, and you go through the same process of collecting information, sorting it according to those 8 key criteria, perhaps working with the agencies when appropriate to analyze the data, and then
aware and concerned with doing something on the national level, their constituents, and kind of provides them the urgency to act.
also ask, since we're almost 3/4 of our time is already gone here, but I think everybody's in the mindset right now about, the new Secretary of Transportation, the bill that's there. And so I don't know, maybe Christine and Anna can talk a little bit about what do you think that Pete Buttigieg is going to be able to accomplish within the next 4 years? And how can we help him do that? Anna, you want to start? Christina? So I put you on the spot there.
Or Christina, you want to go first?
Okay. I think we just have to start with the fact that this particular Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Buttigieg, is doing a fantastic job of telling the story. I don't know that we've had a U.S. Secretary of Transportation in recent history that has been so visible and vocal about the challenges that we face and the needs to home to everybody. He's making transportation relatable, and he's helping everyone in the community understand that it's important that we invest in that, and it's important that we invest broadly and we consider the impacts of our investment. So personally, I'm very excited to see what he may accomplish. But I think the challenge there is in terms of predicting. We're all very hopeful that the American Jobs Plan will get out this year, this legislative session. So this Congress, we're crossing our fingers and hopeful that it's going to get out. But we can't lay that on him. We can't lay that on the president. And ultimately, we can't lay that on Congress. It's going to take all of us working together. And I'm starting to feel a little bit like a broken record here because they are going to respond to what we as a community say is important, what we as voters say is important. And so we need to make sure they understand that this is critically important. It is part of how not only like just what we need to do for every day to make sure that everybody can get to and from work safely, that everybody can have potable drinking water, that, you know, when they flush the toilet, it goes away and it gets treated and it doesn't, you know, pollute a downstream river or lake. It's not just important for that. It's also a critical piece of helping us recover from this pandemic. One of the things we didn't talk about, and we do briefly talk about it in the report card, is the impact the pandemic has had on our infrastructure. In and of itself, very little impact. And in fact, you could say there was less traffic, so less impact on the roads. But in the bigger scheme of things, there's been less revenue generated. There's less funding available. So we do anticipate that there will be an impact on the infrastructure because of the fact that revenue did fall in the past year. It's not reflected in the grades because the grades are a 4-year look, not a 1-year look. So this American Jobs Plan is critical to get out, not just because of that everyday already lingering backlog that we have and the impacts that we experience every single day, but it's also critical to get it out to help us recover from the pandemic. I'm hopeful. There's been a lot of action and discussion and positive talking points on both sides of the aisle. Everybody generally understands that infrastructure is bipartisan. It is important to support. There's a lot of good polling numbers out there from the American public as a whole, as well as from legislators, that this is important. But in terms of predicting, I mean, if I had a crystal ball, right, exactly. So I'm not going to predict, but I am going to say that I'm hopeful. And I'm also excited about the possibilities, given as much focus and attention that is being given to it.
Thank you. So as a closing thing, I'm going to go around and just ask all three of you, what can structural engineers do now and in the next 3 years to hopefully raise that grade from the C-? Steve, do you want to start with some suggestions?
Yeah, I got lots of suggestions. First, just be an advocate and a voice. You can be early in your career and you can get involved. And part of that involvement early might just be learning how things work. Where does funding come from? What can you do on the local level, on the state level, on the national level? So be an advocate. Another thing, as we're working, be wise stewards of the funds that we have. Christina probably appreciates this, being in charge of that kind of thing, but there's limited funding. So when you're working on a project, try to find innovative ways to do things cheaper, more efficiently on the design side, but on the construction side, because that's where a lot of those dollars go. What can you do to stretch the dollar? Some of that might be innovative design practices or construction techniques. So just think that way. And when you're working with your clients, as you're getting farther in your career and you're doing some more planning, help clients to understand where their money is best spent. And I alluded to asset management, I believe, maybe it was Christina, but be a voice that thinking big picture. Don't, and maybe it's the third point, don't just think about a project as a project all by itself in a single little silo. Think about the big picture. How does this project fit into if you're working for a DOT, how does it fit into the DOT's big picture? How is this going to help the area that you're doing this work in? If you think big picture, hopefully that helps you broaden your scope and find ways to, once again, stretch that dollar, but to think about how the decisions you're making on your designs will impact other aspects of our society and of life. Then I think the last one would be actually, I think I covered them all. I think I summarized 4 into 3. I kind of made some quick points in my head. But really, be an advocate, think big picture, and outside of just your project. Be innovative. Young engineers, you might think that all you're doing is learning from the hands of your senior engineers, those that are mentoring you, just reading the code. But think think outside the box a little bit. Don't be afraid to propose something that you think might work that hasn't been done before. That's how innovations happen. So speak up in that sense, and just keep doing good work. Just remember, everything that we do helps make the world a better place and touches on all those categories in the ASCE report card.
That's going to be hard to beat, but
Yeah.
that summary. But Anna, or Christine, do you have anything else that we as structural engineers can do now and in the next 3 years to add on to what Steve said?
I think the first step is to join the Key Contact program if you're not already a member. So it's asce.org/key contacts with an S at the end, or you can email me or email keycontact@asce.org. We'll get you signed up. It's a really, it's a program where you are only as involved as you are comfortable with. So there are different levels of engagement. First, we'll ask you to start reading emails. Then we might ask you to perhaps participate in state report card development or a fly-in or drive-in, eventually working your way up to the Washington fly-in, and then perhaps joining one of our policy committees or the National Report Card Committee. So you can ease your way into it. We make it easy for you, and I think it's a great, as Steve mentioned, it's really important that elected officials hear from you all and that you're involved in these big picture decisions to make sure that the policy is written right, that the programs are implemented right, and that the taxpayer dollars are going towards their best use.
Christina, do you have any comment that you want to add, or?
I would just say none of this is hard.
Yeah.
So the Key Contact program, it's not a lot of emails. It's a handful of emails a year. It's timed perfectly for when you need to react, when you need to respond, and they give you language, like you just click, write your zip code and it goes. You don't even have to come up with the words. So none of this is hard. It's all really easy. And I just encourage everyone. And I liked Steve, and I want to make sure we don't lose this. Steve talked about think outside of your project. And I think sometimes when you get hired as a consultant, you're like, well, this is the project I was given to do. But if you think outside of your project, you might find that there's a solution elsewhere, a different part of the network. You might find that there's something that's totally different outside the box. So I'm just reiterating everything that was said. Think outside your project, ask questions, learn about it, learn and understand. I mean, you already know it, but understand, what the agencies are facing so that you can advocate better on their behalf. And then ASCE through Key Contacts and the fly-in, they'll make it super easy for you to do that.
So one last question we can squeeze in here, I think it's for you, Anna. So there's one, of course, SEI has a global activities division, and ASCE has the Region 10, which we have international members. And their question was, how and should non-US citizens participate in this program, or is there a place for their input?
So we are a federal and state advocacy program and department. So we do focus on Washington and the states as well as localities in our advocacy efforts. I do know there have been a number of other countries that have put together report cards. We can do advisory calls with them. We don't typically do more than that since, keep in mind, ultimately the report card is a tool to communicate with elected officials in your country or your community or your state. So everything works different in other countries. But if you do, if this is an interest area, get in touch. We've had Canada, Australia, South Africa, India was working on a report card. So there's a little bit of precedent for it. And you should ultimately look at developing a report card and an advocacy program in the context of your own government framework.
Right, and this is just a shout out. If you go to the your website, you can also see what's happening with all other legislation too, not just the report card. And it talks about all the bills in the local area that the states are following. So, if you're interested in structural engineering licensure, for instance, you can go and follow what's happening in the different states on that. And so there's a lot of information, just resource on just what the government relations department does for ASCE, which they're located when they're in person off downtown right near the Capitol building. So don't forget to go to that website too. They have a lot of good information on that. So we have just 2 minutes before we close up. I don't know if anybody had any final comments or anything they wanted to add. Just, it's okay if you don't, Steve or Anna or Christine. Are we all set for everything? It's all good, thumbs up. Okay, well, I want to thank you again, Anna, Steve, and Christine. It was a great conversation. I hope our listeners learned a little bit more about the infrastructure report card that was just released a month ago, and how you as a structural engineer, it's important for you to be involved in advocacy and public policy, and how easy it is to do it, and how ASCE and SEI makes that easy for you. So again, thank you so much for all of your help and all of your free time, both Steve and Christine, because I know Christine and you have been doing a lot in the last year as the chair of the infrastructure. And thank you, Steve, for all of your help too at SEI. We are going to be having our next SEI will be in June 9th, and it's going to be on diversity. And we're going to have our young professional chair, Danny Schroeder, is going to be the host for that. So this is going to be concluding the session. It's going to be available on YouTube. So again, I want to thank everybody from ASCE and SEI. So stay safe and have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.